Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Fred and George Weasley are undoubtedly among the most memorable characters in the Harry Potter universe. Cheerful, mischievous, and inventive, they became true sources of light and laughter even in the darkest of times. But behind their reckless humor lie rather serious traits that not everyone notices. Today, we'll talk about the dark side of the Weasley twins. Enjoy the video. Number 1, they're terrible brothers. Ron Weasley always lived in the shadow of his older brothers, and instead of support, he usually got mockery. Fred and George rarely showed brotherly warmth. On the contrary, they often became the cause of Ron's insecurities. They gave him a fear of spiders, accidentally burned his tongue with an experimental spell, and then, without blinking an eye, handed the Marauder's map to Harry, depriving Ron of any chance to shine. Even their younger sister Ginny wasn't spared from their pranks and teasing. The books mention this more than once. For Ron, school life might have been calmer without them than enduring constant humiliation from his own family. Number 2, they lacked discipline. Fred and George broke every rule they could, and surprisingly, they got away with it, perhaps because they were excellent Quidditch players who brought glory to Gryffindor. But their behavior reflected a weakness among Hogwarts teachers who often turned a blind eye to the twins' mischief. Ironically, the only person who managed to rein them in, even slightly, was Dolores Umbridge. Quite the irony, isn't it? Number 3, they had darker tendencies. Fred and George's jokes weren't always harmless. At times, it really seemed like they enjoyed watching others suffer or feel uncomfortable. When Hermione reproached them for being insensitive, they just laughed and said she had no sense of humor. But not every laugh should come at someone else's expense. Their humor often resembled mockery more than good-natured fun. Number 4, they could be cruel. Hogwarts' famous pranksters often crossed the line. Their victims weren't just Slytherins, but also their own relatives. Remember when they booed a Slytherin first year simply because he was sorted into the wrong house? Or when one of their pranks left Ron with a lifelong fear of spiders? Many fans admit there was sometimes too much malice and too little kindness in their behavior. Number 5, they lacked empathy. Fred and George could make anyone laugh, even in the tensest moments. But they rarely thought about the feelings of those they made fun of. Their wit wasn't always appropriate, because not everyone enjoys being the object of laughter. The twins cared more about getting a laugh than about avoiding hurting someone. Even if their pranks weren't meant to be malicious, they almost never showed sensitivity. Number 6, their products were unethical. The products from their shop in Diagon Alley were dazzling, but some were downright concerning. The love potions they sold could easily be misused, and that's exactly what happened. Remember Romilda Vane's attempt to enchant Harry? If the potion had worked, part of the blame would have fallen on the twins, the creators and sellers. They sold their goods for profit without thinking about the consequences. And in the wizarding world, such things can be more dangerous than any curse. Number 7, they weren't that funny. Humor is subjective. Many readers adore the twins, but others find their jokes primitive or even annoying. Sometimes it feels like the author exaggerated their role as comic relief, and behind all the fireworks and wisecracks, the real depth of their characters gets lost. Still, despite all their flaws, Fred and George remain an inseparable part of the Harry Potter atmosphere. Without them, the story would lose much of its joy and perhaps some of its humanity. Number 8, they neglect the safety of others. Fred and George Weasley loved drama. The louder, the brighter, the better. Their fireworks once turned a quiet Hogwarts corridor into a battlefield of sparks and smoke. Catherine wheels chased students through the air, rockets exploded near the ceiling, and a giant firework dragon nearly scorched a tapestry of Helga Hufflepuff. "That'll teach her to mess with us," Fred shouted, laughing as Umbridge ducked for cover. But the joke stopped being funny when a frightened first-year tripped and burned her sleeve. The twins didn't mean harm, but meaning well doesn't erase danger. Their experiments often pushed the limits of safety. Their skiving snack boxes, for example, made students vomit or faint just to skip class. Hermione warned them more than once, someone's going to get seriously hurt. But they only winked and promised better packaging. What they saw as clever invention was in truth carelessness wrapped in laughter. Magic is unpredictable, and every spark has consequences. Fred and George never truly learned that lesson. For them, risk was part of the show, even if someone else got caught in the fire. Number 9, they don't respect authority. Fred and George Weasley never feared authority. They mocked it. Long before Dolores Umbridge arrived, they were already testing limits, detention with Filch, scolding from McGonagall. Nothing stopped them. When McGonagall once warned, "If I ever see you two near that corridor again, you'll wish you hadn't been born," George simply grinned. "We'll take our chances, Professor." It wasn't courage, it was defiance dressed as charm. Their laughter made rebellion look admirable, but it also chipped away at respect for teachers who were trying to keep order in a school already full of danger. Even with McGonagall, who genuinely cared for them, they crossed the line. She defended them when others saw only troublemakers, yet they rarely listened when she spoke seriously. Their resistance to Umbridge felt noble, fireworks, pranks, and a grand exit. But the habit behind it wasn't heroism. It was the same disregard they had shown all along, only now amplified by an audience. Fred and George didn't fight authority because it was unjust. They fought it because they couldn't stand being told what to do. And that perhaps was their greatest weakness, mistaking mockery for bravery. Number 10, they don't think about the consequences. Fred and George Weasley were masters of improvisation. Every idea came with a flash, a spark, and no thought of what might follow. When Professor Umbridge turned Hogwarts into a prison of pink rules, the twins saw their chance to make history. With a cry of, "Give her hell from us, Peeves," they launched their fireworks across the Great Hall, filling the air with smoke and chaos. It was a glorious scene, until teachers had to spend hours putting out fires and calming terrified first years. The twins never stopped to think that rebellion, however dazzling, still leaves ashes behind. Their decision to leave school was just as impulsive. They didn't plan it. They simply mounted their brooms and flew through shattered windows, laughing. To many, it looked heroic, a grand protest against tyranny. But Molly Weasley didn't see heroes. She saw sons throwing away their education, their safety, and their future. "You might have been expelled," she cried later. Fred only grinned. "Didn't feel like waiting around for it, Mum." That single moment of pride could have easily turned into regret, had their gamble not paid off. The truth is, Fred and George built their lives on risk, not reason. Their shop's success came from talent, yes, but also from luck. Luck that their inventions worked, that their timing was right, that war didn't swallow them whole. They never planned, they reacted. And while their courage made them legends, it also showed how dangerous it can be to live for the moment, when every spark you ignite might burn more than you ever intended. Number 11, they abuse their magical abilities. Fred and George Weasley were gifted wizards, creative, daring, and far ahead of their peers. Even Professor Flitwick once admitted they had quite extraordinary charm work. But instead of using that talent to help others or deepen their studies, they turned it into a game. Their inventions, skiving snack boxes, Peruvian instant darkness powder, and Tun-Tung toffees, were clever, yes, but also dangerous. When Dudley Dursley's tongue swelled to the size of a python after eating one, even Arthur Weasley couldn't hide his anger. "You could have killed him," he shouted. The twins only shrugged. To them, it was still a joke. Their mischief didn't stop at the Dursleys. At Hogwarts, they tested their products on classmates, often without consent. Once, Lee Jordan laughed so hard he forgot to breathe after trying a prototype of their new trick suite. It was funny for a moment, until Madame Pomfrey had to step in. The twins treated magic like a toy, something meant to entertain, not to respect. They blurred the line between brilliance and recklessness, turning spells into pranks and potions into weapons of laughter. Magic in the wizarding world carries weight. It shapes destiny, saves lives, and destroys them too. But Fred and George rarely thought about consequences. Their shop, full of glowing bottles and flashing signs, became a symbol of their genius and their irresponsibility. "It's all in good fun," they'd say, but fun without control is chaos. In the end, their talent could have changed the world. Instead, it too often changed people's patience or their health. Number 12. They don't respect other people's work. Fred and George Weasley loved to make people laugh, but too often their laughter came at someone else's expense. They didn't mock out of cruelty. It was their way of showing affection, or so they thought. But for those on the receiving end, it didn't always feel that way. Hermione, for instance, was often teased for her dedication to studying. When she proudly earned 10 outstanding grades, Fred smirked, "Blimey, Hermione, did you leave any marks for the rest of us?" It sounded harmless, yet it dismissed hours of her effort with a single joke. Percy, however, suffered the most. He was ambitious, disciplined, and desperate to prove himself. But to Fred and George he was perfect Percy, a walking punchline. When Percy became a prefect, they didn't congratulate him. They pinned a fake big head boy badge to his robes. What they saw as humour, he felt as humiliation. "Oh, shut up," Percy snapped once, red-faced, as they roared with laughter. He worked harder than anyone, but his achievements were always turned into jokes. That constant mockery chipped away at his confidence and deepened the distance between them. Even Ron wasn't safe from their teasing. They often laughed at his attempts to live up to his older brothers, calling him our little hero after his minor successes. Ron's temper flared easily, but behind his irritation was hurt. He wanted recognition, not ridicule. Fred and George never meant to belittle him, but their habit of joking about everything made it impossible for anyone near them to be taken seriously. The Weasley twins saw humour as their strength, but sometimes it blinded them to the value of other people's work. They never realized that respect isn't shown by laughter, but by silence, by letting someone else have their moment. And in their endless chase for a good punchline, they forgot that even jokes can leave scars. Number 13, they are a bad example to follow. At first glance, Fred and George Weasley seem like the kind of heroes every Hogwarts student dreams of becoming: bold, funny, and free. They mocked the rules, outsmarted the teachers, and turned every dull day into a carnival. But beneath that charm lies a dangerous message: rebellion without purpose. Their laughter often came at someone else's expense, and their jokes blurred the line between courage and irresponsibility. "Give her hell from us, Peeves!" Fred shouted as they left the school in Order of the Phoenix. It was iconic, but it also glorified defiance for the sake of spectacle. To the younger students, the twins became legends. First years whispered their names in admiration. Even Ginny looked at her brothers with a mix of awe and amusement, but admiration can be misleading. When you see someone celebrated for breaking rules, you start to believe that consequences don't matter. Fred and George didn't just make mischief, they made mischief look admirable, and in a school where discipline was already fragile, their behavior planted the seed that cleverness could replace conscience. Their influence reached beyond Hogwarts walls. Ron, their younger brother, often tried to live up to their energy but failed to match their confidence. He joked when he was nervous, teased when he was unsure, habits he clearly picked up from them. Even Harry, who deeply respected them, sometimes fell into the same pattern of impulsive defiance. It wasn't that the twins were evil. They weren't. But they showed how easy it is for laughter to drown out empathy and for charm to hide carelessness. In the end, Fred and George's charisma became both their gift and their curse. They inspired others, yes, Mina, but not always toward wisdom. A true role model doesn't just make you laugh, they make you better. The Weasley twins, for all their brilliance, rarely did that. They taught Hogwarts how to laugh at fear, but not how to face it. And that perhaps is the most dangerous kind of influence. Number 14, they are selfish toward their parents. Molly and Arthur Weasley were not rich, but they gave their children everything that truly mattered: warmth, guidance, and unconditional love. Yet Fred and George often acted as if that love came with no strings attached. They mocked Percy, the son their parents were most proud of, and ignored Molly's constant worries. When Molly scolded them, they laughed it off, brushing her concern aside as just another mum moment. But behind her frustration was fear. Fear that her boys would ruin their future before it began. Their biggest act of defiance came when they left Hogwarts without warning. In Order of the Phoenix, after their explosive farewell stunt, Molly's reaction was not pride, it was heartbreak. She had hoped her sons would finish school, earn their NEWTs, and build steady lives. Instead, they soared away on broomsticks, leaving behind smoke, laughter, and a mother who could only watch helplessly. To her, it wasn't bravery, it was recklessness. Even their famous shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, began as a source of anxiety. "They'll never make a living from joke products," Molly said, her voice trembling. And for a time, she was right to worry. Fred and George risked everything: their future, their safety, even their family's trust, for a dream no one else believed in. They never stopped to ask how their choices made their parents feel, or how much sleepless worry they caused back at the Burrow. Ironically, the very thing that once made their parents panic later became the family's pride. Their shop flourished, and Molly finally smiled at what her sons had built. But that doesn't erase the pain of those earlier years, the late-night arguments, the disappointment, the silence. Fred and George loved their parents, yes, but love without consideration can easily look like selfishness. Number 15, they violate personal boundaries. Fred and George Weasley were the kings of laughter at Hogwarts, the heartbeat of mischief that made the castle feel alive even in its darkest days. But behind their contagious humor, their sparkling eyes, and their endless pranks, there was a side of them often overlooked, a line they crossed far too often, not out of malice, but out of the careless conviction that laughter excuses everything. They believed that a joke, even when it hurt, was still just a joke. Yet anyone who ever found themselves on the other end of their laughter might tell a different story. Their charm lay in confidence. Fred and George walked the corridors like they owned them, tossing jokes, fireworks, and teasing remarks as freely as confetti. They made professors groan and students cheer. But there were moments when the joy of the crowd masked discomfort, moments when their humor stopped being harmless. Their energy could be overwhelming, their disregard for personal space disarming. They barged into rooms without knocking, opened letters that didn't belong to them, and treated privacy as a temporary obstacle in the name of entertainment. "No need to be so serious," Fred would often say, smirking, but sometimes seriousness was exactly what the situation required. It was Hermione Granger who most often stood as their moral compass, the voice of reason amid chaos. She admired their creativity but despised their lack of boundaries. The twins found endless amusement in provoking her. They would tamper with her books, enchant her quills to sing, or switch her ink with disappearing potion. For them, it was good fun. For her, it was humiliation. Once, when she discovered that her essay for Professor McGonagall had vanished in front of her eyes, Fred had laughed so hard he nearly fell off his chair. Hermione, shaking with fury, called them utterly immature. Fred only grinned wider. To him, her anger was proof the joke had worked. Yet the harm lay deeper. Hermione's frustration was not because of the lost parchment. It was the feeling of being dismissed. She was the cleverest witch of her age, but her emotions were treated as a punchline. Her protest, "That wasn't funny," would echo in vain. The Weasleys' defense was always the same. "Oh, lighten up, Hermione." In those moments, laughter became a weapon, used to invalidate and silence discomfort. What began as mischief turned into something more invasive, a disregard for another's feelings under the banner of humor. Their disregard for boundaries did not stop with Hermione. In the burrow, even their family wasn't safe. Their younger sister Ginny learned this early. When she was about 10, Fred and George enchanted her diary to read aloud her private thoughts during breakfast. Their mother was horrified, and Ginny burst into tears. "It was only a bit of fun," George protested, but their mother's face went pale with fury. Ironically, that moment foreshadowed the tragic story to come. Years later, Ginny's real diary, the one possessed by Tom Riddle, would nearly destroy her. The brothers never connected the two events, but it remains one of the most haunting examples of how a small invasion of privacy can grow into something devastating. The pattern repeated at Hogwarts. When Ron Weasley began dating Lavender Brown, Fred and George turned his newfound awkwardness into a public spectacle. They teased him endlessly, sent enchanted heart-shaped candies to his table, and once slipped a singing valentine into his bag. Ron's embarrassment was immense. "You'd think brothers would understand," he muttered once. But Fred and George were never cruel in the way of bullies. Their cruelty was careless. They believed their laughter absolved them. The intention was fun, but intention does not erase effect. Even Harry Potter himself wasn't immune. The twins loved him, respected him, even admired his courage. Yet they often treated his fame as a source of endless amusement. During his 4th year, when Harry's name was drawn from the Goblet of Fire, Fred and George joined the chorus of disbelief, demanding proof that he hadn't cheated. They weren't malicious, but their teasing carried a sting. Harry had already been alienated by much of the school, and their playful suspicion deepened his isolation. Later, when they realized the truth, they apologized with laughter, not words. Harry accepted it because that's who he was, loyal and forgiving, but the unease lingered. Their approach to humor often blurred into intrusion. In Order of the Phoenix, as the Weasley twins waged their rebellion against Dolores Umbridge, many hailed them as heroes. Their fireworks, their swamp, their daring defiance, these became legend. Yet hidden beneath that glory was the same tendency to impose laughter upon others. When they tested skiving snack boxes on younger students, they rarely asked for consent. Lee Jordan once mentioned that some of the students got genuinely sick, but Fred only shrugged. "All in the name of progress," he said. They valued innovation and audacity above sensitivity. For them, the end justified the means. The difference between mischief and disrespect lies in awareness. The twins were aware of rules, but not always of emotions. Take Neville Longbottom, for example, a boy who had faced ridicule most of his life. One afternoon, Fred bewitched his shoes to squeak loudly with every step, causing a roar of laughter in the common room. Neville flushed crimson and left without a word. It seemed minor, even forgettable, but it was a cruel reminder that for some people, laughter wounds more than it heals. When George later remarked, "He'll toughen up," it showed how deeply they misunderstood the difference between humor and harm. Number 16, they can't take criticism. Fred and George Weasley have always been the golden duo of laughter and chaos in the wizarding world. Their pranks were legendary, their confidence unshakable, and their timing impeccable. Yet beneath that dazzling surface of humor and daring lies a fragile thread, a deep discomfort with criticism. They could mock anyone, including their own teachers and family, but when the mirror turned toward them, their reaction was always the same: sarcasm, deflection, and laughter used as armor. It was not that they were cruel, but rather that they were not ready to face the possibility that their mischief could cause harm. The truth was that behind every explosion of fireworks and every enchanted trick suite, there was an unwillingness to admit fault, even when the evidence was staring them in the face. The Weasley twins grew up in a house full of noise, jokes, and hand-me-downs. Humor was their way of surviving the chaos of 7 children and limited money. From early on, Fred and George learned that laughter earned them attention, the kind of attention that wasn't overshadowed by Bill's achievements, Charlie's adventures, or Percy's perfectionism. In a sense, mischief became their identity. But the problem with defining oneself through defiance is that it becomes nearly impossible to accept correction without feeling threatened. When someone told them they'd gone too far, it wasn't just about the prank. It felt like an attack on who they were. That explains why when Hermione Granger, with her sharp intelligence and practical nature, tried to warn them about their dangerous products, they treated her words not as concern, but as an insult. It happened in their later school years, during their growing obsession with developing joke products for Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. They were experimenting with skiving snack boxes, those colourful candies that could make a person vomit or faint on demand to escape class. Hermione, as usual, saw beyond the fun. She warned them that some of their products could genuinely hurt people, that magical illnesses induced by sweets weren't harmless games. Fred and George brushed her off with smirks and witty retorts. One of them remarked that Hermione ought to lighten up and stop worrying so much about imaginary dangers. Their laughter filled the common room, but the truth behind Hermione's concern was not imaginary at all. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, even when students began using the products excessively, the twins refused to take the situation seriously. Their defense mechanism was humor, a tool that protected them from shame but also kept them from growth. Fred and George's inability to accept criticism was most evident in the way they interacted with authority. When Professor Umbridge terrorized the school, their defiance became heroic. Students cheered, teachers smiled behind closed doors, and Hogwarts itself seemed to approve when their fireworks turned the pink tyranny into chaos. But what people forget is that their rebellion, while glorious, was also reckless. They didn't stop to think about consequences, not only for themselves, but for others. Filch was nearly driven mad by their magical mayhem. Students got caught in crossfire, and the school descended into near anarchy. The twins were proud of it. When anyone hinted that perhaps their actions could endanger others, they dismissed the thought. Fred once said that Umbridge deserved every bit of it, and in their eyes that justified everything. They were right. Everyone else was too uptight, and that became their philosophy. No reflection, no remorse, just laughter to drown out doubt. Hermione's warnings represented something the twins couldn't handle, the idea that their fun might not be as harmless as they believed. For Fred and George, Hermione symbolized rules and order, two things they had spent their lives running from. When she told them their joke products could get them expelled, they laughed. When she pointed out that some of their tricks bordered on illegal, they shrugged. Fred said once, "If you're not a little scared, you're not doing it right." It sounded bold and adventurous, but it also revealed how deeply they equated fearlessness with maturity. They confused recklessness with strength. The moment someone suggested they were irresponsible, they didn't engage, they attacked with humor. A raised eyebrow, a snide comment, or a sarcastic grin were their weapons. They never argued to understand, they argued to protect their pride. This resistance to criticism even extended to their family. Molly Weasley, their mother, often scolded them for turning their talents toward pranks instead of academic excellence. Instead of taking her worries seriously, they treated her as the joke itself. When she found out about their secret shop plans, they laughed off her fears about their future. "Don't worry, Mum," George once said. "We're not exactly aiming to be the next Percy." Oh, that comment hurt more than they realized. It wasn't just a jab at their brother's stiffness. It was a defense mechanism. They mocked what they couldn't face, the idea that maybe, deep down, they were afraid of failure. To accept their mother's criticism would have meant accepting vulnerability. And that was something neither twin was ready for. Their shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, became their triumph. Proof that they had been right all along. The laughter, the success, the fame, it all seemed to validate their defiance. Yet even then, their inability to listen followed them. When Ron, now more cautious after years of danger, warned them about selling products to younger students, they ignored him. "If they've got the money, they can handle it," Fred said. That kind of statement revealed the same immaturity that had shadowed them at Hogwarts. The twins' wit had matured, but their emotional awareness had not. They never truly developed the ability to separate criticism from personal attack, and in the end, that made them fragile beneath the laughter. Number 17, they lack gratitude. Fred and George Weasley have long been the embodiment of chaos and charm in the wizarding world, a pair of red-headed rebels who laughed in the face of rules and brought joy to readers with their clever inventions and unbreakable spirits. Yet, hidden beneath the laughter and pranks lies an uncomfortable truth that many overlook. Gratitude never came easily to them. While their family lived with modest means, while their mother scraped together every knut to buy books, robes, and wands for 7 children, the twins often behaved as though the world owed them amusement and applause. Their humor was infectious, yes, but it often concealed a sense of entitlement that seemed out of place in the humble Weasley household. From their earliest appearances, Fred and George operated by their own moral compass, one that bent more toward mischief than mindfulness. When their mother scolded them for their antics at the Quidditch World Cup, they brushed her off with grins, unwilling to take responsibility for the stress they caused. When their father's reputation at the ministry was jeopardized by their experiments with trick sweets, they laughed. Their charm made it easy to forgive, but it also made it easy for them to escape reflection. They were not cruel, not even selfish in the ordinary sense, but They were blind to the depth of sacrifice that surrounded them. Gratitude, for them, was an afterthought, something unspoken, easily replaced by a joke. The Weasleys lived on the edge of poverty, and everyone in the family carried that burden with quiet dignity. Percy sought success and order. Ron felt the sting of hand-me-downs. Ginny dreamed of proving herself beyond her family's reputation. But Fred and George, for all their wit, often dismissed that struggle as background noise. Their confidence gave them the illusion that hard work was unnecessary, that brilliance and boldness alone could carve out a path. Their famous joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, did not emerge from nothing, but it also did not emerge solely from their effort. Behind the scenes, someone else's generosity played a crucial role. Harry Potter, the boy who had already given the wizarding world its freedom and risked his life countless times, was the one who quietly made their dream possible. After winning the Triwizard Tournament, he handed the entire 1,000-galleon prize to the twins. "You can have it," Harry said simply. "I don't need it. I'd rather it went to you." It was not a business transaction. It was an act of friendship, of faith in their potential. And yet, in the pages that follow, Fred and George never truly express heartfelt gratitude. They accept the gift with enthusiasm, even excitement, but not reverence. Their thanks come in the form of a laugh and a promise to do something worthwhile with it. The warmth of real appreciation, something as simple as a sincere acknowledgement of what Harry's sacrifice meant, never appears. It's not that they were unkind, it's that they didn't stop long enough to feel the weight of what was given. In the chaos of youth, they saw Harry's generosity as natural, almost expected. After all, Harry was their best mate, the one who always helped, always gave, always stood between others and pain. Gratitude requires humility, and humility was one quality the twins rarely showed. Their brilliance made them fearless, but it also made them forget how much easier their journey became because of others. They turned Harry's kindness into a footnote in their success story. Their joke shop became one of the most successful businesses in Diagon Alley. The twins' talent was undeniable. Their products were innovative, hilarious, and technically sophisticated. But every shelf in that store carried the silent echo of Harry's gold. Every laughing customer was in a way a continuation of Harry's selfless gesture. The irony is sharp. Fred and George, who mocked authority and dismissed convention, owed their independence to the one person who never sought recognition. When Harry walked into their shop years later, he was greeted with excitement, yes, but not with the gravity that his role deserved. They offered him discounts and gifts, not gratitude. In their world, laughter replaced acknowledgement, and jokes became currency for affection. Their lack of expressed gratitude extends beyond Harry. It coloured their relationship with their parents too. Molly Weasley, who cried over their danger and worried about their future, was often met with exasperation when she tried to guide them. She wanted them to be safe, stable, part of a family she could rely on. But Fred and George treated her concerns as background noise, an inconvenience to their vision of independence. When they flew out of Hogwarts in a blaze of fireworks and defiance, the world saw a triumphant act of rebellion. Molly, however, saw two sons walking away from everything she had built for them. They never paused to thank her for the years she held their family together, for the food on the table, the patched robes, the unwavering love. Gratitude is not only words, it's awareness, and awareness was something the twins lacked in abundance. It is tempting to defend them by saying that humor was their way of showing love, that laughter was their language of gratitude. Yet even humor requires empathy to be kind. Fred and George's jokes sometimes crossed that line. They turned Ron's fears into punchlines, teased Percy's ambition with cruelty, and laughed at Hermione's seriousness. Their laughter connected them to others, but it also distanced them from the emotional truths that bound their family. When Ron looked at them with both admiration and hurt, they rarely noticed. When Molly begged them to be careful, they smirked and moved on. Their brilliance blinded them to the quiet kind of love that sustains families through hardship. Number 18. Fred and George Weasley ignore the morality of their inventions. Fred and George Weasley were, to most readers, the embodiment of youthful rebellion. Their laughter echoed through the halls of Hogwarts, their pranks softened the tension of dark times, and their defiance of authority was often seen as a refreshing spark of light. Yet behind the colourful banners and enchanted fireworks of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes lies a deeper, more troubling layer, one that reveals how far moral boundaries can blur when fun becomes an enterprise. What began as playful mischief evolved into a profitable business built on deceit, discomfort, and danger. It is a world where laughter sometimes hides the shadow of irresponsibility. Their inventions were not merely toys. The shelves of their shop in Diagon Alley overflowed with products that could manipulate minds and bodies alike. The skiving snack boxes, a bestseller, were designed to make students ill enough to skip class, causing symptoms such as vomiting, nosebleeds, and fainting spells. Hermione Granger once remarked that the twins were encouraging rule-breaking and dangerous behavior, a criticism they brushed aside with grins. But a closer look at the concept raises ethical questions. To willingly create substances that make people sick, even temporarily, for profit and amusement, is a questionable act. The laughter of the buyer does not absolve the seller of responsibility for harm. Fred and George's defense, implicit in their charm, was that their customers knew what they were buying. In their view, they were providing tools for harmless mischief, empowering students to rebel against rigid structures like Dolores Umbridge's oppressive regime. Indeed, in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, their products became symbols of resistance. But moral righteousness is not determined solely by intent. It also depends on consequence. A nosebleed in Umbridge's classroom may have been a victory for freedom, but the same potion in a different context, a child testing it on a friend, a prank gone wrong, could easily become cruelty. And in their world, accidents had a habit of turning dark very quickly. The moral void at the center of their creativity becomes clearer when we consider the love potions. Displayed in glittering bottles and advertised as a humorous way to attract affection, these concoctions strip away the autonomy of the victim. A person under the influence of such a potion is no longer capable of genuine consent. Their emotions are chemically altered, their will replaced by artificial desire. In Half-Blood Prince, when Romilda Vane tries to use a love potion on Harry, the situation turns almost tragic. Ron accidentally consumes it, becoming infatuated and delusional. What began as a joke ends with a near-fatal poisoning after Slughorn's antidote nearly comes too late. It is a direct consequence of the same potion the twins sold in their shop, framed as harmless fun. The danger is not that Fred and George were malicious, but that they were blind to the ethical implications of their craft. They saw their creations through the lens of humor and rebellion, never through the eyes of the potential victim. When they introduced Peruvian instant darkness powder, they marketed it as a convenient tool for escape or pranking. Yet the same powder was later used by Death Eaters during the attack on Hogwarts in Half-Blood Prince. The twins' pride in their invention turned into horror when it became clear that what was meant to amuse could be weaponized. That moment reflects the painful truth that innovation without reflection can lead to moral disaster. In the world of magic, power magnifies consequence. Every charm, every potion, every gadget carries the potential to heal or harm. Fred and George, as gifted inventors, were fully aware of this duality. Still, they often ignored it. Their products were distributed widely, and their fame made them household names. Young witches and wizards idolized them. Yet none of their advertisements ever mentioned caution, age restrictions, or the possibility of misuse. In that sense, their moral compass was less aligned with Dumbledore's wisdom and more akin to Gilderoy Lockhart's showmanship, fame over responsibility, applause over accountability. There is a moment in Order of the Phoenix when their pranks against Umbridge reach their climax. The fireworks explode across the Great Hall, dragons roar in the air, and students cheer their liberation. It is one of the most exhilarating scenes in the series, a triumph of youth over tyranny. But even there, Rowling leaves a subtle warning. The same defiance that brings laughter also leaves behind chaos. When they vanish from the castle, leaving behind portable swamps that even Flitwick admires for their cleverness, we are invited to admire their genius, but not their ethics. They never pause to ask whether they've set an example of rebellion without responsibility. George's later loss of an ear during the Battle of the Seven Potters brings a cruel irony. For once, the brothers face the physical cost of danger firsthand. The injury, caused by dark magic, mirrors the harm that magic can inflict when control is lost. Fred jokes about it, saint-like, George says of his missing ear. But beneath the humour lies a grim echo of what they had long dismissed, that magic is never just fun and games, it demands respect. In a way, this tragedy humanizes them. It forces a moment of introspection that their younger selves never allowed. The moral contrast becomes starker when we compare them to Hermione. While the twins created love potions, Hermione founded SPEW, a society defending house elf rights, both acts of creativity, but rooted in entirely different ethics. Hermione's work was empathy-driven, seeking to correct injustice. The twins' inventions were pleasure-driven, often ignoring the cost. This juxtaposition shows how Rowling's world constantly balances intellect, emotion, and morality. Fred and George's brilliance lacked the moral anchor that made other characters like Hermione or even Harry truly heroic. Another troubling product is the patented Daydream Charm, which allows the user to experience vivid fantasies for 30 minutes. Marketed as guaranteed distraction for class, it effectively manipulates the mind to produce artificial reality. It is not inherently evil, but it teaches escapism as a virtue and avoidance as empowerment. In a world already filled with illusions and deceptions, such charms blur the line between fantasy and moral detachment. The twins' success thus reflects not only their wit but also society's willingness to laugh at irresponsibility when it is wrapped in glitter and charm. Their father, Arthur Weasley, represented the opposite kind of inventor, curious, gentle, but always mindful of consequence. His fascination with Muggle artifacts was rooted in wonder, not profit. He sought understanding, not control. The twins inherited his ingenuity, but not his restraint. When Fred and George left Hogwarts before completing their education, they symbolically rejected the discipline and moral formation that might have tempered their creativity. Their dropout was framed as liberation, but perhaps it was also escape from accountability, from ethical growth. Harry Potter himself admired them, often seeing in them the freedom he longed for amid his burdens. Yet even Harry recognized the danger of unchecked experimentation. He hesitated to use their products when lives were at stake, as during the infiltration of the Ministry. Fred and George would have loved this, he once thought, if it weren't so deadly. His reflection captures the paradox. Their inventions inspired courage and laughter, yet flirted constantly with peril. In their brilliance, they walked a razor's edge between heroism and irresponsibility. It is tempting to excuse the twins by their youth. They were, after all, young men who had grown up during war, seeking light amid darkness. But youth does not absolve one of reflection. Their shop became a sanctuary of distraction in grim times, and for that many were grateful. Still, every laugh echoing through their aisles carried an unspoken cost, the normalization of mischief without conscience. In a post-war world rebuilding its moral foundations, that message lingered uneasily beneath the surface of joy. When Fred dies during the Battle of Hogwarts, the laughter stops abruptly. His death, one of the most devastating in the series, recontextualizes everything. The twin who brought so much joy becomes a symbol of loss. It is as if the narrative itself punishes the absence of seriousness. George's silence after Fred's death is not only grief, it is realization. The consequences of life and magic have caught up with them. The games are over. In that moment, their legacy becomes more complex, a story of genius shadowed by the price of moral blindness. After the war, George continues the shop, now alone. We can only imagine the quiet hours when the jokes no longer sound the same. Perhaps in those moments he understands what their laughter had concealed. Their inventions changed the world, but not always for the better. They taught others to bend rules, to trick, to outsmart, but rarely to care. Their magic brought delight, yet it never learned humility. Behind every glowing product label was a silent question they never answered. What happens when fun hurts someone else? And that perhaps remains the most troubling legacy of Fred and George Weasley. Number 19, Fred and George Weasley don't develop as characters. Fred and George Weasley have always been the embodiment of chaos wrapped in charm, twin streaks of rebellion in a world that often took itself far too seriously. When we first meet them in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, they burst into the story like fireworks, literally the kind of boys who'd rather turn a rule into a punchline than obey it. Their humor was infectious, their timing impeccable, and their love for mischief seemed almost heroic against the dull backdrop of school uniform order. Yet beneath that laughter there lies a question that grows louder with each passing book. Why don't they change? Everyone else in Harry's world is transformed by war, pain, or revelation. But Fred and George? They remain fixed in amber, forever 17 in spirit, immune to the emotional gravity pulling everyone else toward adulthood. It isn't that they lack intelligence or initiative. On the contrary, they are two of the most inventive characters in the entire saga. Their prank products, skiving snack boxes, extendable ears, portable swamps, demonstrate not only brilliance but a daring kind of entrepreneurial spirit. When they open Weasley's Wizard Wheezes in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, their shop becomes one of the few symbols of colour and laughter in a London darkened by Voldemort's return. And yet, this very achievement, remarkable as it is, feels strangely hollow. They've conquered Diagon Alley, but not themselves. Their business is an extension of their mischief, not a sign of evolution. They never step beyond the bounds of their own jokes. Fred and George's refusal to evolve becomes clearer when we place them alongside characters like Neville Longbottom or even Draco Malfoy. Neville begins as a timid, fumbling boy who loses his toad more often than his composure. By the end, he is slaying Nagini and leading Dumbledore's army. Malfoy, once cruel and arrogant, learns fear, shame, and the complexity of conscience. But the twins, despite all they see, Cedric's death, the fall of the Ministry, Dumbledore's funeral, seem untouched. The laughter never falters. The jokes never end. Their world is one long punchline, and they never seem to ask themselves what happens when the laughter stops. There's a scene in Order of the Phoenix that captures this perfectly. Hogwarts is collapsing into tyranny under Dolores Umbridge. Fred and George decide to turn their rebellion into a grand spectacle. They set off fireworks, summon dragons of light, and leave a swamp in the corridors. It's exhilarating, a moment of liberation for students who have been suffocating under rules. The whole castle cheers. Yet the moment also reveals their ceiling. Their defiance is performative, never introspective. They challenge authority, yes, but never reflect on the nature of power, responsibility, or consequence. Their rebellion is clever theatre, not moral evolution. Even their departure from Hogwarts, one of the most iconic moments in the series, shows their emotional stasis. As they soar away on their brooms, Fred shouts, "Give her hell from us, Peeves!" The line is funny, triumphant, unforgettable. But it's also a closing statement for who they are. They don't stay to fight injustice through strategy or courage. They leave with laughter and chaos trailing behind them like sparks. In contrast, other students stay to build resistance from within. Fred and George escape into a joke, while others confront a reckoning. Their relationship with Percy Weasley also exposes this stagnation. Percy, ambitious and pompous, becomes estranged from his family. It would have been powerful to see the twins, with all their energy and wit, bridge that gap, to learn empathy and see their brother not as a target for ridicule, but as a human being blinded by pride and fear. But they never do. Their jokes about Percy remain the same from the first book to the last. They mock his prefect badge in Chamber of Secrets, his ambition in Goblet of Fire, and his betrayal in Order of the Phoenix. When Percy finally returns to the family during the Battle of Hogwarts, there's no deep reconciliation between them, only a tragic, fleeting moment before Fred's death. Fred's death should have shattered that eternal grin, not only for the readers, but for George himself. And yet even in tragedy there's a strange stillness. We never see George's grief unfold. We never hear of guilt, regret, or transformation. In Deathly Hallows, George loses half his identity, his twin, his echo, and still the story doesn't explore his change. One could argue that J.K. Rowling intended the silence as a form of respect, a grief too deep for words. But it also reinforces the twins' narrative incompleteness. They existed as a unit, as a perpetual motion of laughter. Once broken, the motion stops and nothing takes its place. Contrast this again with Ron Weasley, their younger brother. Ron begins as a shadow, living under the brilliance of others, joking to cover insecurity. But Ron grows. He learns loyalty's cost, jealousy's sting, and courage's quiet weight. By Deathly Hallows, he's no longer the comic relief, but a man who walks back into danger after abandoning his friends. Fred and George, who might have been mentors or mirrors to Ron, remain flat. Their humour, once freeing, becomes almost tragic in hindsight, a shield they never lowered. There's also the question of moral learning. The twins are pranksters, yes, but sometimes their pranks border on cruelty. In Goblet of Fire, they try to cheat the age line around the Goblet of Fire, ending up with long white beards. It's funny. But earlier, they're selling trick sweets that make people vomit or faint, without considering the ethics of manipulating others' bodies for laughs. Their mischief is rarely questioned within the story, as if humour grants immunity from reflection. Hermione Granger occasionally scolds them, but her concerns are brushed aside as nagging. The narrative allows the twins' charm to overshadow their accountability. What's most ironic is that Fred and George, with their creative brilliance, could have been some of the most complex characters in the series. Imagine if they had grappled with the consequences of their inventions being used in war. Their joke products later served the Order of the Phoenix. Extendable ears become espionage tools. Shield hats deflect curses. Their business, built on laughter, becomes a weapon supplier for rebellion. Yet we never see them question that transformation. The moral tension between comedy and conflict remains unexplored. One might say that the twins represent constancy, the light in dark times, the laughter that never dies. And that's true in a symbolic sense. When everything collapses, they keep the flame of joy alive. But constancy without growth becomes stagnation. A joke repeated too long loses its spark. The twins' brilliance could have evolved into something deeper. Wit tempered by wisdom, courage born from loss, humor with heart. Instead, they remain trapped in their own brilliance, as if their purpose is to remind us of who everyone else used to be before the world grew darker. The tragedy of Fred and George is not only that one of them dies, but that neither of them ever truly lived beyond the boundaries of laughter. They are Peter Pan figures in a story about growing up. The war which transforms so many around them barely touches their inner world. They lose friends, see death, witness horror, and yet never articulate what it means. They are, in a sense, emotional spectators to their own story. Their immortality in readers' hearts is secured not by growth, but by charm. And perhaps that's the saddest thing of all. If we look closely at the moment of Fred's death, Rowling gives us the faintest flicker of change, too late to blossom. He dies laughing, having just shared a joke with Percy after years of estrangement. For one heartbeat, the laughter is pure, not mischievous, but forgiving. Percy had just returned to the family, begging for forgiveness. Fred's last words are, "You actually are joking, Percy. I don't think I've heard you joke since you were—" And then the explosion cuts him off. It's poetic and cruel. The first moment of genuine reconciliation is silenced forever. The story teases us with the possibility of growth, only to snatch it away. After Fred's death, George's silence should have been the start of something transformative, a reckoning, a maturity born of loss. But the series ends before we can see that. In the epilogue, we learn that George names his son Fred, continuing the echo. It's touching, yes, but cyclical. The Weasley twins' legacy becomes self-repetition, not evolution. The laughter returns, but the lesson never comes. Perhaps then Fred and George Weasley are symbols not of growth, but of resistance to it, the eternal jesters standing on the edge of tragedy, daring the world to laugh even as it burns. Their brilliance lies in what they refuse to become. But for characters who lived through 7 years of darkness, their refusal to change leaves an emptiness in the story's emotional tapestry. Everyone else in the saga grows, breaks, rebuilds. Fred and George simply remain. And in a world that demands transformation, perhaps that is their most human flaw. Number 20, Fred and George Weasley mock those who don't fit in. Fred and George Weasley were Hogwarts' golden twins, charming, loud, and irresistibly funny. Their jokes filled the castle's corridors with laughter and chaos, and few students could resist their infectious energy. Yet beneath their mischievous glow lay a truth that often went unnoticed. Their humor, while clever and creative, sometimes came at a cost. The cost was borne by those who already felt isolated, awkward, or different. The Weasley twins were not cruel in the traditional sense, but their laughter occasionally carried a sting that left others smaller than before. Percy Weasley was the first and most frequent target. His seriousness, his ambition, and his obsession with rules made him an easy subject for mockery. Fred and George constantly referred to him as Perfect Percy, turning his dedication into a punchline. Percy wouldn't recognize a joke if it danced naked in front of him wearing Dobby's tea cozy, Fred once said. To the twins it was harmless teasing, a brotherly way of keeping Percy from becoming too pompous, yet from Percy's perspective, the laughter reinforced his alienation within his own family. He already struggled to be taken seriously in a home where chaos and noise ruled, and the twins' constant ridicule only widened the emotional distance. When he later chose to side with the ministry over his family, it was easy to dismiss him as arrogant, but perhaps part of his decision came from years of being the family's internal joke. Hermione Granger, another frequent target, often found herself on the receiving end of their sharp wit. She was the know-it-all, the girl whose raised hand seemed permanently glued to the air. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when Hermione was passionately defending house elves' rights through SPEEW, Fred and George snickered at her efforts. Fred remarked that she should save the hats for the elves who want them, mocking her activism as naive. To them, it was another opportunity for humor, another absurd crusade to laugh about. But for Hermione, who constantly fought for recognition and respect in a male-dominated, often dismissive environment, those jokes reinforced the message that earnestness and empathy were laughable. Fred and George's teasing, however small it seemed, reflected a broader Hogwarts culture, one that prized coolness and conformity over compassion. Luna Lovegood entered the picture later, and for the twins, she was a paradox. Her eccentricity, her dreamy manner, her radish earrings, all these made her an easy source of amusement. Though Fred and George were less overtly cruel to her than others, they didn't protect her either. The laughter that followed Luna through the halls of Hogwarts wasn't always malicious, but it was isolating. The twins, who thrived on humor, could have used their popularity to defend her. They could have turned her oddness into a badge of honor. Instead, they watched from the comfortable position of insiders, occasionally amused but rarely empathetic. Their silence was part of the problem. When laughter is power, withholding it from someone or using it to diminish them is a choice that defines character. There was a pattern in the twins' behavior. They ridiculed what they didn't understand or didn't value. Percy's seriousness clashed with their spontaneity. Hermione's idealism confronted their cynicism. Luna's imagination defied their grounded mischief. Their humor, though creative, often sought balance by making someone else the butt of the joke. In the Gryffindor common room, they were adored. Their pranks were legendary, their charm disarming. Yet the applause they received depended on an unspoken agreement that some people, those less witty or less fun, were fair game. It was laughter built on hierarchy, not equality. Fred and George's humor also reflected the culture they grew up in. The Weasley family was large and poor, and humor was often a defense mechanism. Laughter became a form of rebellion against hardship, against ridicule from others. In that sense, their mockery wasn't purely malicious, it was survival. But as they grew older, their jokes hardened into something sharper. The twin dynamic amplified everything. Each joke had to top the last. Each insult had to earn a louder laugh. In that echo chamber of mirth, empathy had no space to grow. They became entertainers first, brothers second, and kind classmates perhaps last. Their relationship with Harry Potter also revealed this duality. They admired him, respected his courage, and even defended him against Umbridge and the Ministry. But their admiration didn't prevent them from laughing at his discomfort when the Triwizard Tournament named him as an unexpected champion. "He's loving it, the great Harry Potter," George joked, echoing the skeptical tone of the other students. Even though they later stood by him, their initial reaction showed how quick they were to join collective ridicule before empathy. Humor was their instinct, not reflection. Fred and George's most defining moment of humour came during their grand exit from Hogwarts. Their fireworks stormed through the castle, Umbridge's face turned purple, and every student cheered. It was rebellion, liberation, and artistry all at once. Yet even this triumph carried undertones of exclusion. The twins' world had always been divided between those who got the joke and those who didn't. If you laughed with them, you belonged. If you were the target, you were left behind. That boundary, subtle but powerful, mirrored the social divisions they claimed to mock. Consider Neville Longbottom, for example. In the early years, he was clumsy, timid, and frequently humiliated. Fred and George did occasionally show him kindness. They gave him chocolates, defended him from Snape's cruelty, but they also participated in the general amusement at his expense. When Neville's forgetfulness or fear caused another disaster in Potions class, laughter often followed, and the twins didn't stop it. It's easy to be kind when someone is brave. It's harder to be kind when someone is weak. Neville's growth into a hero in the final book stands in quiet contrast to the twins' brand of humour. His courage was born of empathy, not applause. The twins' joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, represented the pinnacle of their dream, but even their products carried the echoes of their schoolyard mentality. Love potions, trick wands, puking pastilles all relied on deception, on making someone else the unsuspecting victim of laughter. Their genius was undeniable, but their morality remained grey. In Half-Blood Prince, they even sold you-know-poo products mocking Voldemort himself, a brilliant act of resistance cloaked in humour. Yet the question lingered, if laughter was their weapon against evil, why couldn't they wield it with equal compassion toward those who were merely different? It would be unfair to paint them as villains. Fred and George were brave, loyal, and ultimately selfless. Fred died fighting for the very freedom his laughter once symbolized. His death shattered the world of humor that had once defined him, leaving behind silence where laughter used to be. But perhaps that silence invited reflection. The tragedy of Fred's death forced George and readers to reconsider the weight of their laughter. Humor is fleeting, kindness endures. The twins had spent their youth choosing the former, and the cost became painfully clear. Looking back, their teasing of Hermione, Percy, and Luna was not the malicious bullying of Draco Malfoy. It was subtler, easier to excuse because it came wrapped in warmth and wit. That made it more dangerous. A cruel joke told with a smile still wounds, especially when the laughter comes from those who hold social power. Hogwarts was a place where humour could elevate or destroy, and the twins wielded that power effortlessly. They were adored, but adoration without self-awareness is a fragile thing. Even within Gryffindor, their behaviour highlighted the gap between courage and kindness. Courage is loud. It charges into battle, defies authority, breaks rules. Kindness is quiet. It listens, supports, and resists cruelty without applause. Fred and George embodied the former but often neglected the latter. Being brave enough to face Voldemort was heroic. Being brave enough to stand beside Luna when others laughed would have been extraordinary. The difference between the two defines maturity. Their humour also spoke to a broader truth about the wizarding world. It valued conformity. Those who were normal or popular were celebrated. Those who were strange or studious were tolerated or ridiculed. The Weasley twins thrived in that culture because they gave it what it wanted, an easy target, a reason to laugh. Their jokes made others forget discomfort, but they also made Hogwarts forget compassion. That's the paradox of comedy. It can unite people, or it can build walls. Fred and George were not bad people. They were human, brilliant, flawed, and full of contradictions. Their laughter was both a shield and a sword, protecting them from pain while cutting into others without realizing it. Percy's loneliness, Hermione's frustration, Luna's quiet sadness, all carried traces of the twins' careless humor. In the end, the problem wasn't that they laughed too much. It was that they didn't always ask who was left out of the laughter. True courage, as Dumbledore once said, is not the absence of fear, but the ability to stand up for what's right. For the twins, the challenge was never fear, it was empathy. Their story reminds readers that wit and wisdom are not the same. To be truly great, laughter must include kindness. To be truly brave, one must defend not only against evil, but against cruelty disguised as amusement. Fred and George Weasley made Hogwarts laugh louder than ever before, but sometimes the loudest laughter hides the deepest silence. Number 21. Fred and George Weasley's rebellion against Umbridge hurt others. Fred and George Weasley's rebellion against Dolores Umbridge was one of the most spectacular and liberating moments in the history of Hogwarts. The sight of fireworks exploding through the Great Hall, of enchanted Catherine wheels whirling across the ceiling, and of Umbridge's furious attempts to restore order, felt like poetic justice. To many students, it was a long-awaited victory, a slap in the face of tyranny. But behind the laughter and the cheering crowd, there lay something far less glorious. The chaos that followed their grand escape carried consequences that few anticipated, and even fewer were prepared to face. The Weasley twins, for all their wit and courage, had started a fire that burned brighter than anyone expected, and it was the other students who felt its heat. The moment was, of course, unforgettable. As described in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Fred and George's departure began with an explosion of fireworks that defied Umbridge's every rule. "Accio fireworks!" shouted Filch in vain, while magical dragons and rockets whirled past him, spelling words like unbridgeable in blazing gold. It was mischief elevated to art. Yet, when the last spark faded and the laughter died down, the corridors of Hogwarts no longer felt simply rebellious. They felt broken. Umbridge, humiliated and furious, doubled her cruelty. Punishments became harsher, curfews stricter, and the atmosphere turned from oppressive to unbearable. The fireworks had been beautiful, but they left behind smoke, thick and choking. Professor McGonagall, who had often tolerated Fred and George's antics with stern amusement, seemed torn between pride and regret. She had admired their spirit, even offering subtle encouragement when they defied injustice, but now she had to deal with the aftermath: damaged classrooms, students skipping lessons, and an educational process collapsing under the weight of defiance. The swamp the twins left in one corridor became a symbol of both resistance and recklessness. It was a complete swamp with bubbling greenish water and reeds sprouting from the floor, as the book described. Flitwick kept a small corner of it as a reminder, saying it was a really good bit of magic, but the rest of the teachers had to wade through days of confusion. For many students, the Weasleys' act was a spark of hope. They had given the oppressed a moment of laughter, a sense that Umbridge could be defeated. Yet others were not so amused. Younger students, especially first and second years, felt unsafe walking the halls filled with leftover chaos. The poltergeist Peeves, inspired by the twins' rebellion, became uncontrollable, cheering them on with cries of, "Give her hell from us, Peeves!" He obeyed, gleefully. But his pranks grew darker. He shattered lamps, blocked stairways, and once nearly injured a Ravenclaw girl by dropping a heavy ink bottle from the ceiling. What began as defiance quickly turned into anarchy. Hermione Granger, ever the voice of reason, saw this clearly. Though she had laughed with the rest, she later confided that Fred and George's methods were reckless and dangerous. In her eyes, rebellion required strategy and unity. Harry's Dumbledore's army had been built with those principles: secret meetings, practical defense lessons, solidarity among students. But the twins' departure was theatrical, self-contained. They had made their point, but they had not stayed to help clean up the mess. Their exit on broomsticks over the lake. Fred and George turned their brooms sharply in the air and sped out of the open front doors into the glorious sunset, was cinematic. It also symbolized abandonment. The emotional toll on Hogwarts was immense. Students were divided. Some idolized the twins as heroes. Others whispered that they had left everyone else to face Umbridge's wrath. The inquisitorial squad, emboldened by her anger, began hunting for anyone who might have aided the rebellion. Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws, often caught in the crossfire, suffered detentions for offences as trivial as laughing at a joke. The sense of solidarity that had once united the students under Dumbledore's army began to splinter. Fear returned, colder and sharper than before. Even Harry, who admired Fred and George deeply, felt the weight of their absence. Their laughter had always lightened the darkness, but now it echoed like a memory in a school that felt more like a prison. He remembered Fred once saying, "You don't want to mess with this place once we've finished with it." At the time, it had sounded like a promise of fun. Later, it seemed more like a warning. The Weasleys' shop in Diagon Alley would soon become a beacon of joy, but in that moment their choice to leave Hogwarts felt like a betrayal, not of friendship, but of the fight. The teachers, too, were caught in a moral dilemma. They loathed Umbridge's rule, but could not condone open rebellion. Flitwick, Sprout, and even Hagrid had their small acts of resistance, but they operated quietly, protecting students where they could. Fred and George's chaos forced them to choose sides publicly, something many of them could not afford to do. It is telling that when Umbridge tried to clear the swamp, Flitwick refused to help her, claiming he didn't have the authority. Yet behind that small act of defiance lay exhaustion. The faculty were fighting to maintain even a semblance of normalcy. There is also a moral complexity in the twins' actions that goes beyond good or evil. They were not villains. Far from it. They were young men raised in a house that valued courage above all, taught by a mother who believed in fairness, and shaped by a world that rewarded boldness. But courage without foresight can wound as easily as it heals. Their fireworks lit up the sky, but they also cast shadows. Shadows in which frightened students and disillusioned teachers tried to find their footing. In retrospect, their rebellion was less a battle cry and more a desperate scream for freedom. Hogwarts under Umbridge had become unbearable, a place where even laughter felt forbidden. Fred and George simply refused to be silenced. Yet, in breaking their chains, they inadvertently left others bound tighter. It was the paradox of youthful revolt, the belief that liberation for oneself equals liberation for all. But true freedom requires collective effort, not a dramatic exit. When news spread of the twins opening Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, many students felt pride. They had escaped, yes, but they had also built something extraordinary. Their success stood as proof that imagination could survive oppression. Still, for those left behind, especially Neville Longbottom, Luna Lovegood, and others in Dumbledore's army, the absence of Fred and George's energy was deeply felt. They were the embodiment of resistance through humour, a power Hogwarts desperately needed. The swamp, ironically, outlasted Umbridge. It was finally cleared only after she was gone, and many older students looked at it as a relic of defiance. Yet for some professors, it was a reminder of chaos. a symbol of how easy it is for noble intentions to spiral out of control. In that greenish water and those floating reeds lay the memory of laughter, pain, and consequence. McGonagall's silent glance each time she passed that corridor said everything, pride tinged with sorrow. There is something tragic about how quickly the world forgets the costs of rebellion. When Fred later dies in the Battle of Hogwarts, his courage is rightly remembered, but few recall the lessons of his school days, that even righteous defiance carries a price. The swamp was cleaned, the fireworks faded, but the tension and fear that followed had already left scars. Perhaps that is the true legacy of their rebellion, the reminder that justice pursued without care can leave collateral damage in its wake. Looking back, one might wonder what would have happened if the twins had stayed. Could their creativity have fueled a more organized resistance? Could they have worked with Harry, Hermione, and Ron to strengthen Dumbledore's army from within? It is impossible to say. What is certain is that their departure marked the end of an era at Hogwarts, the moment mischief stopped being harmless and became a weapon. The rebellion of Fred and George Weasley was not a failure, but neither was it a pure triumph. It was a moment of blazing colour in a dark chapter, a reminder of how laughter can be both salvation and chaos. As the enchanted fireworks spelled their last word, Weasley's wizard wheezes, coming soon, the school watched in awe. Yet behind that spectacle, a quiet truth lingered. Sometimes the brightest sparks leave the deepest burns. Number 22, Fred and George Weasley avoided real responsibility. Fred and George Weasley had always been the heartbeat of laughter at the Burrow, the unshakable twins whose jokes filled the air even in the darkest of times. But when the Second Wizarding War began, when the Order of the Phoenix gathered once again to stand against Voldemort's terror, the twins' choice suddenly appeared less amusing and more complex. While others, their own family members, stepped directly into danger, Fred and George turned toward Diagon Alley, opening their shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. The shop was a dazzling success, filled with magical fireworks, trick wands, and potions that made you vomit on command. Yet in that glittering chaos of invention, one question lingered. Were Fred and George truly rising to the challenge of the times, or were they running from the weight of responsibility? The world around them was unraveling. Dumbledore's army trained in secret, members of the Order patrolled the streets, and Harry Potter himself, their younger brother's best friend, was marked for death. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Voldemort's return was denied by the Ministry, people like Sirius Black and Remus Lupin risked their lives to fight in the shadows. And yet, in those same chapters, Fred and George were plotting how to escape Hogwarts and build a business empire of laughter. They used Umbridge's tyranny as a springboard for fame. Their legendary exit, fireworks, blazing across the sky as they vanished on broomsticks, was an act of rebellion, yes, but not an act of resistance. They left chaos behind, but did not stay to face its consequences. One cannot ignore the brilliance of their minds, their products, skiving, snack boxes, shield hats, decoy detonators, later proved useful to the Order and even to the Ministry itself. As Hermione once remarked, "Those two are geniuses. They could have been in the top of their class if they'd wanted, yet their genius was aimed at profit, not protection." It was a lighter kind of courage, one that entertained rather than endured. In Half-Blood Prince, when the war raged outside and students were vanishing, Fred and George were testing love potions and selling fake wands to delighted customers. Their shop had become the brightest place in Diagon Alley, as the narrator describes, but outside its doors the streets were growing darker by the day. Bill Weasley worked for Gringotts and faced Goblin's distrust as he helped the Order decipher curses. Charlie handled dragons in Romania, providing insights about magical creatures during the war. Even Percy, estranged as he was, chose the path of official duty, however misguided. Ron left Hogwarts to hunt Horcruxes with Harry and Hermione, facing death at every turn. And Fred and George? They stayed behind the counter, selling wonder and mischief. Their mother, Molly, once cried that she wished they'd chosen something safer. Yet ironically, their business became a way to hide from danger, not face it. The twins, who once mocked fear, had quietly let it dictate their choices. In times of crisis, every wizard faced a mirror that reflected who they truly were. For Harry, it was the willingness to die for others. For Neville, it was standing up even when trembling. For Fred and George, that mirror showed something less flattering, an unwillingness to grow up. Humor was their armor, deflecting responsibility like one of their own shield hats. They didn't join the Order immediately, though their family begged for help. Instead, they focused on expanding their shop's reach, sending products to Hogwarts, and even making secret deals with students to smuggle items past the Carrows. Their rebellion remained safe, indirect, and always laced with laughter. There is a tragic irony in that, because behind their laughter was intelligence that could have saved lives. Fred and George had invented Peruvian instant darkness powder, extendable ears, and even portable swamps that could stall entire battalions. Their inventions later helped the Order's members escape from ambushes, and even Harry used them to infiltrate the Ministry. But the twins themselves were rarely there when the danger unfolded. Their tools fought, but they did not. It was as if they chose to let their creations carry the burden of bravery for them. When Harry returned to the Burrow between missions, he would find their parents aged and weary, Arthur working endless shifts at the Ministry, and Molly keeping her fear bottled behind smiles. Fred and George visited occasionally, bringing jokes and gifts, but their absence from the war's front lines was impossible to ignore. The Weasleys were a family of fighters, and yet two of their brightest sons had chosen commerce over courage. Even in Deathly Hallows, when the Order was planning its most dangerous operation, moving Harry from Privet Drive, Fred and George participated, but only as part of a large group. They were brave, yes, but not initiators. They followed when asked, rather than stepping forward on their own. Some might argue that humor itself was a weapon, that in times of fear, laughter became an act of defiance. Fred and George certainly believed that. In their shop window, they displayed you-know-poo, the constipation sensation that's gripping the nation, mocking Voldemort's name when no one else dared to speak it. It was a kind of bravery wrapped in satire. And yet satire does not stop a killing curse. While their joke products made people laugh, real people were dying. Tonks fell, Lupin fell, Dobby fell, and in that growing list of casualties, the laughter from Weasley's wizard wheezes began to sound hollow. There was another layer to their avoidance: fear of failure. Fred and George had grown up in the shadow of their older brother's achievements. Bill was the scholar adventurer, Charlie the dragon tamer, Percy the ambitious bureaucrat, and Ron, unexpectedly, became the best friend of the chosen one. The twins had always played the role of jesters because it was safer than competing in a world of heroes. Responsibility meant the risk of disappointment. Their humor was not just rebellion, it was defense. When the world turned deadly serious, they clung to the only identity they knew: the laughing inventors who never stayed for the ending of the story. It's telling that Fred's death came not during a grand battle he initiated, but amid chaos he didn't control. During the Battle of Hogwarts, when the twins finally joined the fight in full, Fred was caught in an explosion, killed mid-laughter, with Percy finally at his side. The moment is cruelly poetic. Fred's courage, delayed for years, arrived too late. His death shattered George, and perhaps that was the final punishment of avoidance, to lose everything when one finally chooses to face it. The twin who had always made others laugh left the world in a moment that silenced everyone. After the war, George's life was a shadow of what it once was. The shop continued, but it became a monument to what they had lost. Each product, each joke, now carried a trace of grief. The laughter they had sold to the world had come at the price of never truly engaging with it. Their legacy was bittersweet, a world that smiled because of them, but one that had to mourn without them. Responsibility, the very thing they had avoided, found them in the most permanent way possible. Fred and George Weasley were not cowards. They were brilliant, creative, and deeply loyal, but loyalty without action becomes sentiment. Their brand of courage was one of comfort, not confrontation. They fought through invention, not intention. In contrast, Harry, Ron, and Hermione faced the darkness directly, willing to be broken by it. Fred and George hid from that darkness behind laughter. It was a choice that seemed innocent, even admirable, but beneath it was the same fear that drives many to pretend the world's problems can be solved with a joke. One cannot judge them too harshly, for escapism is a human instinct. The twins provided hope to others, even when they couldn't face their own fears. Their store became a refuge for those who needed to believe in something joyful amid despair. But for all the laughter they spread, Fred and George's story is also a cautionary tale that humour without responsibility is only half of virtue. It can ease pain, but it cannot heal the wound that causes it. The world needed heroes, and they, perhaps unknowingly, chose to be entertainers instead. In that choice lies the essence of their tragedy. They were capable of greatness, but satisfied with applause. Their mother's words, spoken long before the war's end, "You could have done anything if you'd applied yourselves," now echo like prophecy. The twins' greatest invention was not a product but a mask, one that shielded them from the world until the world could no longer be ignored. And when that mask finally cracked, it revealed what they had feared all along, that laughter cannot replace legacy. Fred and George Weasley will always be remembered for the joy they brought to the wizarding world. Yet between the laughter lines of their story lies a more painful truth. In an age when others chose sacrifice, they chose safety. Their jokes filled the silence left by those who had fallen. But silence, too, speaks. And it whispers that even the brightest sparks can hide the darkest doubts. Number 23. Fred and George Weasley encouraged a culture of permissiveness. Fred and George Weasley were never just pranksters. They were symbols of rebellion inside Hogwarts' brick walls, their laughter echoing through corridors like a secret anthem against order itself. While other students whispered about potions, homework, and house points, the twins were always plotting something far more spectacular, an explosion of fireworks, a swamp across the castle, or a product from their experimental joke line that could turn one's tongue into a snake. Their charm was undeniable, and their genius for mischief often made teachers sigh in reluctant admiration. Yet behind the laughter there was something deeper and more troubling, the quiet erosion of respect for structure, discipline, and authority. From their very first appearance, Fred and George treated Hogwarts not as a school, but as a stage. Every rule was a prop, every teacher a potential audience. When Harry Potter entered their world, a boy already burdened by fame and defiance, the twins became his partners in controlled chaos. They supplied him with the Marauder's Map, a magical artifact that revealed every secret passage and moving figure in the castle. It was a brilliant gesture of brotherly affection, but also a dangerous one. "This, Harry, is the secret to our success," they said, before handing it to him. With that map, boundaries ceased to exist. Harry could slip unseen through corridors, past curfews and rules, all under the approving eyes of the Weasley twins. What was once forbidden became an invitation to adventure. Teachers, particularly Professor McGonagall, found themselves caught in a strange dilemma. She recognized the twins' intelligence and inventiveness, but could never fully contain them. When she confiscated their contraptions or deducted house points, they grinned and accepted punishment as part of the show. It was as if authority itself had become another character in their game, predictable, limited, and easy to outwit. Even Dumbledore, usually a pillar of balance between discipline and kindness, often seemed amused by them rather than concerned. His tolerance only reinforced their belief that laughter could erase consequences. For younger students, Fred and George became legends. First years whispered their names as if they were mythical figures. They watched in awe as the twins set off fireworks shaped like dragons during OWL exams or distributed sweets that caused uncontrolled nosebleeds. In the halls, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes became a slogan of freedom. Those who feared failure, who dreaded detentions, found comfort in the idea that the rules were flexible. If Fred and George could break them with style and still be loved, then perhaps everyone could. And so a subtle culture grew, one where respect for order seemed old-fashioned, and rebellion felt like the only way to earn admiration. Harry's friendship with them deepened this dynamic. He was drawn to their fearlessness, their lightness in the face of authority. After years of neglect at the Dursleys, Hogwarts was his first home, and the twins' acceptance was intoxicating. They were the older brothers he never had, encouraging, daring, and endlessly creative. But in following them, Harry absorbed a view of rules as obstacles rather than guidance. Their influence shaped his approach to danger, to secrecy, to trust. When he sneaked into restricted sections of the library or defied Umbridge's decrees, it wasn't only courage that drove him, it was the echo of Fred and George laughing in the back of his mind. The twins' most notorious act came during Dolores Umbridge's reign as High Inquisitor. They transformed the oppressive atmosphere of Hogwarts into a carnival of defiance. Their grand exit, setting off fireworks, creating chaos, and leaving behind a swamp in the middle of a corridor, was celebrated as a triumph of freedom. Students cheered, teachers smiled behind their hands, and even Dumbledore seemed to approve. But what was truly left behind was a precedent. Authority could be mocked and ignored if done with enough style. The swamp became a monument to irreverence. The message was clear. Rules were temporary, but spectacle was eternal. It is easy to see why Fred and George were adored. They embodied everything young people dream of being: bold, funny, untouchable. But beneath that surface lies a question that J.K. Rowling never fully resolved. What happens when laughter replaces responsibility? In a place meant to teach discipline, respect, and moral growth, their legacy was one of joyful anarchy. The world outside Hogwarts was not as forgiving. Later, during the war, when the twins joined the Order of the Phoenix, their humor took on a darker edge. The jokes continued, but the stakes were life and death. Perhaps it was then that even they began to understand that breaking rules in wartime had different consequences than breaking curfew at school. In one of the most striking scenes, after opening their shop in Diagon Alley, Fred and George became the face of commercialized rebellion. "Why are you worrying about you-know-who? You should be worrying about you-know-poo, the constipation sensation that's gripping the nation," they advertised. It was clever, brilliant even, but it also trivialized fear. Their humor turned the darkest threat of the wizarding world into a punchline. In a time when unity and seriousness were needed, they sold laughter as the ultimate escape. And while that laughter gave people hope, it also encouraged denial, a refusal to face reality. Some would argue that their mischief was harmless, even necessary, that Hogwarts needed their light-heartedness to balance its strictness. Yet the line between rebellion and irresponsibility is fragile. Consider how often their inventions endangered others, fainting fancies, puking pastilles, and canary creams, all causing physical distress, all used for amusement. These weren't innocent jokes. They normalized the idea that inflicting discomfort could be funny if it provoked laughter. It was a philosophy where empathy bowed to entertainment. The twins' attitude toward authorities spread beyond Hogwarts. Ron, their younger brother, often admired them but struggled to find his place in their shadow. His own insecurities grew beside their loud confidence, and in many ways, their dominance shaped the Weasley family's dynamic. Mrs. Weasley's constant anxiety about their future was dismissed as overprotectiveness, but she was the only one who foresaw the danger of their recklessness. She once said, "You could have been killed, or worse, expelled." And though she meant it in jest, the fear behind it was real. To her, their charm didn't erase the worry that someday their laughter might end in tragedy. Fred and George also challenged the very foundation of Hogwarts' values. The school thrived on a delicate balance between individuality and order, creativity and discipline. The twins tilted that balance toward chaos. Their disregard for rules made professors' authority appear hollow. When they left school mid-year in a blaze of fireworks, the message to every student was unmistakable. Learning is secondary to spectacle. In that moment, Hogwarts stopped being a sanctuary of wisdom and became a theatre of rebellion. Even years later, when reflecting on their actions, one cannot ignore the cost of their defiance. Fred's death during the Battle of Hogwarts stands as a chilling symbol of that cost. The laughter that once filled corridors ended in silence. The boy who had turned mockery into magic was taken by the very chaos he once celebrated. The irony was unbearable. Fred Weasley, who made others forget fear, became a victim of the world's cruelty. George, left behind, could no longer find joy in the mischief that once defined him. The brothers who had treated rules like playthings learned that the world was not always a game. And yet, their spirit persisted in others. Students remembered them not for their danger, but for their freedom. They had made Hogwarts feel alive, unpredictable, thrilling. The trouble was that the culture they created blurred the line between courage and carelessness. In a world already threatened by darkness, their example suggested that authority, no matter how just, was something to be laughed at. Perhaps Fred and George were necessary mirrors to Hogwarts' rigidity. They revealed the absurdity of blind obedience and the humanity behind rebellion. But in doing so, they built a kingdom where charm excused transgression. When Harry used the Marauder's map to sneak out, when students broke curfew to follow his example, they were echoing the same logic the twins had championed, that wit and bravery justified disobedience. Even in the end, when George looked upon the ruins of the castle and the body of his brother, the price of that laughter became clear. The culture of fearlessness that once liberated them had also blinded them. Their lives had been a protest against control, Yet what they fought against was also what kept them safe. Hogwarts had rules for a reason, not to suffocate its students, but to protect them from the very chaos they unleashed. Fred and George Weasley were not villains, but they were reminders of how easily brilliance can turn into recklessness when unchecked by responsibility. Their story was not just about laughter, but about the quiet cost of making fun of everything, even the things that matter most. Number 24. Fred and George Weasley never took Ron seriously. Fred and George Weasley, always the source of mischief and laughter at Hogwarts, are iconic characters in the Harry Potter series, known for their pranks and unshakable bond. However, hidden behind the veil of their ever-jovial personalities is a problematic aspect of their relationship with their younger brother, Ron Weasley. The twins, while never truly malicious, often treated Ron with a lack of understanding and consideration that over time had a deep impact on him. From the very beginning of their lives together, Fred and George used Ron as a punching bag for their jokes, teasing and pranks, all in the name of fun. But beneath this playful exterior there was a pattern that went unnoticed by many, the silent toll it took on Ron's self-esteem and his sense of worth. Ron's life was filled with moments where he felt overshadowed, both by the brilliance of his brothers, particularly Bill, Percy and Charlie, and by the constant comparison to Harry Potter. But one of the sharpest sources of his insecurity came from Fred and George, whose playful treatment of him was not just a form of sibling rivalry, it was a deep-seated dismissal. It wasn't that they intended to hurt him, at least not intentionally, but their actions still had consequences, shaping Ron into someone who would never fully appreciate his own value. Whether it was the constant teasing about his awkwardness or their frequent use of him in their pranks, Ron rarely found himself treated with the same respect or regard as his older brothers. The pranks, while harmless on the surface, often involved Ron in uncomfortable or humiliating situations. Fred and George delighted in making him the brunt of their jokes, with little thought to how their actions might affect him. Take, for example, their behavior during their time at Hogwarts. Their most well-known prank, setting off an enormous firecracker in the Gryffindor common room, making the entire castle shake, was something that could easily have been overlooked as a harmless joke. But it was the moments leading up to this event that highlighted their tendency to sideline Ron. Whenever Fred and George concocted their latest scheme, Ron was often the one to get caught up in their mess. Their use of him as an unwitting accomplice was often done without any consideration for his comfort or desire to be involved. In particular, the moment when they launched their joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, marked a turning point in how Fred and George began to treat Ron. Instead of acknowledging Ron's contributions or even his worth, beyond being a target for their pranks, they set out to build their empire by further alienating him. Ron's efforts to support them in their endeavors were often dismissed with playful disregard, a slap on the back with a comment like, "You'll be great in business, little bro, just don't mess up the shop." While this might have seemed like a small jest, the subtle implication was that Ron was somehow incapable of succeeding on his own terms. 4. Someone who already struggled with his sense of self-worth, this reinforcement of inferiority did nothing but deepen his feelings of inadequacy. One of the most significant examples of Fred and George's disregard for Ron occurred in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. During a meeting in the Burrow, Fred and George were excitedly recounting their successful joke shop venture and teasing Ron about his lack of interest in joining them. While they were excited about their success, Ron felt left out. Instead of offering any support or encouragement to his brother, Fred and George's response was to poke fun at him, which only made Ron feel smaller. The event was a sharp reminder that despite being part of a close-knit family, Ron was often treated as though he were less significant, less capable, and less interesting than the other Weasleys. The twins' teasing wasn't just limited to their playful remarks. They often pulled pranks on Ron, exploiting his insecurities in the process. One of the most notable examples occurs in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when Fred and George mock Ron's nervousness about playing in the Quidditch World Cup. They teased him about his abilities, even suggesting he was only on the team because of his last name. Their jokes were presented as harmless banter, but the underlying message was clear. Ron was only ever going to be defined by his family, never by his own merit. It wasn't the teasing itself that caused Ron the most pain, but rather the constant reinforcement of the idea that his existence, his talents, and his potential were secondary to the success of his brothers. This constant undermining of his confidence created a narrative for Ron. He wasn't good enough. He wasn't funny like Fred and George, nor was he as brilliant as Percy or as athletic as Charlie. The weight of this belief began to shape his actions and interactions, creating a vicious cycle of self-doubt that he couldn't easily escape. In fact, there were moments when Ron even doubted his place within his own family. He compared himself to his brothers and found himself lacking in every area. When Ron did try to stand up for himself, it was often in the face of great frustration, and it usually ended in him retreating further into his insecurities. But it wasn't just Fred and George who contributed to Ron's growing sense of self-doubt. They played a crucial role in the absence of support when Ron needed it most. There were times when all Ron wanted was a moment of affirmation, a word of encouragement to remind him that he mattered. But instead of providing this, Fred and George often swept his concerns aside. Their relentless pursuit of humor and entertainment, while admirable in many ways, left Ron with a sense that he was expendable, someone who could be easily ignored or laughed at. This lack of sincere support from Fred and George became more glaring during pivotal moments in Ron's life. One such instance occurred when Ron found himself struggling with the weight of his newfound fame. With Harry's constant presence as the chosen one, Ron was forced to confront his own obscurity. While Fred and George continued to build their joke shop empire, completely absorbed in their success, they failed to notice the quiet battle Ron was fighting within himself. The deeper Ron's sense of insignificance grew, the more distant he became from his brothers, despite their shared history. In contrast to Fred and George's dismissive behavior, Harry became a silent pillar of support for Ron. Despite his own burdens, Harry consistently proved to be more considerate and compassionate toward Ron's feelings. Harry never used Ron for pranks or belittled him for his shortcomings. Instead, Harry offered Ron something that Fred and George rarely did: understanding and respect. The difference between Harry's supportive nature and the twins' disregard for Ron's struggles was stark, and it made Ron realize just how important it was to have someone who valued him for who he truly was, not for what he could be used for. Ron's insecurities may have been compounded by the behavior of his brothers, but they didn't define him entirely. With time, Ron began to find his own voice, especially as he became more confident in his own abilities. His friendship with Harry, in particular, helped him develop a sense of self-worth that had been sorely lacking in his early years. While Fred and George's constant teasing never truly stopped, Ron slowly learned to rise above it, finding strength in his own identity. However, the scars of years of ridicule never truly disappeared, lingering quietly beneath the surface. The story of Fred and George's treatment of Ron is a painful reminder of the ways in which sibling relationships can shape a person's sense of self-worth. While their pranks were meant to be fun, they often crossed a line, leaving Ron with a legacy of insecurity that took years to overcome. Had Fred and George taken the time to offer Ron the support and encouragement he desperately needed, perhaps his journey would have been different. But instead, Ron's path to self-acceptance was fraught with struggles that were often ignored by those who should have cared the most. The scars of their neglect became part of his story, shaping who he was and who he became. Number 25. Fred and George Weasley could be cruel even to their friends. Fred and George Weasley were two of the most beloved characters in the Harry Potter series, known for their mischievous antics, jokes, and prank-filled nature. They brought laughter and lightness to a world that often seemed overshadowed by darkness. However, when one examines their interactions more closely, it becomes clear that their humor and sense of friendship sometimes bordered on cruelty, especially toward those closest to them. The twins were not just pranksters, they were at times harsh and even dismissive toward their friends, a side of them that is easy to overlook amidst their more lovable traits. Their relationship with their friends was complicated, and though they may have been good-natured at times, they could also be surprisingly insensitive. One of the most notable examples of Fred and George's troubling behavior is seen in their treatment of Hermione Granger. Hermione, the hard-working and serious-minded friend of the Weasley twins, often found herself the subject of their mockery. The twins, who relished in mischief and light-hearted rebellion against authority, mocked Hermione for her dedication to her studies. Her eagerness to excel academically was something they never understood, and rather than offering support or simply letting her be, they frequently ridiculed her. Fred and George enjoyed teasing Hermione not only for her studious nature, but also for her attempt to appear proper in the face of their more carefree approach to life. In The Goblet of Fire, the twins find it endlessly amusing when Hermione insists on helping them with their studies. Instead of respecting her dedication, they laugh it off as something silly and laughable. To them, it was always about having fun, and anything that didn't align with that philosophy was fair game for ridicule. While they were certainly not malicious in intent, their teasing could sting, especially considering Hermione's already vulnerable position as someone often misunderstood by her peers. This behavior could be seen as dismissive, a sign of how easily the twins took advantage of their close friendships for entertainment. The twins' treatment of Neville Longbottom is another example of how their sense of humor sometimes went too far. Neville, who struggled with self-confidence throughout the series, became an easy target for their jokes and pranks. Fred and George, who had a tendency to push boundaries, would often mock Neville for his clumsy nature and perceived lack of skill. While their pranks were often aimed at making others laugh, the repeated mockery of Neville only deepened his insecurities. Fred and George's behavior was typical of how they perceived their friendships. It seemed as though the twins felt entitled to do whatever they liked, as long as it was framed as just a joke or all in good fun. Neville, who often found himself the butt of jokes at school, never seemed to receive the sympathy or protection that someone like Harry or Ron might have gotten from their friends. The twins' treatment of Neville, poking fun at his awkwardness and playing pranks on him, showed how the boundary between fun and cruelty was often blurred for them. This, of course, wasn't done with malice, but the effect on Neville was still painful, making him feel like he was not part of the circle of close friends, but rather a target for amusement. While Fred and George may have seen themselves as harmless jokers, their behavior also impacted their other friends, particularly Ron. Ron, who had always struggled with his self-esteem in comparison to his more successful brothers, was often left in an uncomfortable position when Fred and George would turn their humor toward him. They teased him like they did with everyone else, but sometimes the jokes hit a little too close to home. For example, their constant mocking of Ron's fears and insecurities about his place in the family and his abilities added another layer to his already complex feelings about being a Weasley. It was clear that despite the twins' loyalty to Ron, they sometimes overlooked the sensitivities that came with being part of a large family, where comparisons were inevitable. Fred and George's jokes, even if well-meaning, often touched on his personal struggles, making him feel less than or excluded. Their jokes would often remind Ron that, in the Weasley family, he was often seen as the underdog. This dynamic, where the twins' humor sometimes bordered on insensitivity, is an example of how their relationships with their friends were not always as carefree as they appeared. Even when it came to their involvement in the larger battles of the wizarding world, Fred and George were still guided by their playful nature. Their pranks, like the creation of their joke shop, were intended to bring lightness to a world filled with darkness, but their humor didn't always translate well in serious situations. During the Battle of Hogwarts, Fred and George were instrumental in the fight, using their inventions and pranks as a way to subvert the Death Eaters. However, even in this moment of gravity, Fred's sense of humor remained unfiltered. He joked and laughed in the midst of chaos, something that could be seen as either a coping mechanism or a lack of understanding of the true cost of the war. The tragic loss of Fred during the battle highlighted how his pranks, often an escape from serious matters, could not protect him in the end. The reality of war and loss was something the twins had never truly reckoned with, and Fred's death was a harsh reminder of how their light-heartedness was not enough to shield them from the cruelty of the world. Their relationship with Harry Potter was also defined by humor, but it was not always a one-sided friendship. Harry, who had lost his parents and often carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, found solace in Fred and George's jokes. However, the twins' treatment of him was often laced with an undercurrent of competition. While Harry could always count on Fred and George for support, he was never immune to their teasing. The twins enjoyed poking fun at Harry's fame and his sometimes naive sense of responsibility. The jokes were not malicious, but were a reflection of how Fred and George, like all their friends, took advantage of their close relationships for personal amusement. There was a clear sense that their friendship with Harry was, in some ways, transactional. They supported him in his quest against Voldemort, but they also made fun of him when they felt it was deserved. The twins' playful nature was undoubtedly a key part of their character. Their pranks were legendary, and their ability to make others laugh was a gift. However, as we see throughout the books, their sense of humor often masked deeper complexities in their relationships with their friends. Fred and George were not perfect friends, and their tendency to overstep boundaries, often disguised as jokes, showed how friendship for them was sometimes a free pass to behave however they pleased. This was most evident in their treatment of Hermione, Neville, Ron, and even Harry. While their humor made them popular and loved by their peers, it also showed that being just friends did not excuse them from showing respect for others' feelings. Their behavior also hinted at an underlying flaw in their understanding of what true friendship meant. To Fred and George, it was clear that friendships were built on shared jokes, laughter, and the occasional prank. But there was a sense of entitlement in their actions, an assumption that being close friends gave them the right to push boundaries, even at the expense of others' feelings. The more their jokes hurt those around them, the clearer it became that they sometimes viewed friendship as a permission slip to act without consequence. Fred and George, despite their best intentions, occasionally blurred the lines between fun and respect, showing that their understanding of friendship was complex and at times misguided. Ultimately, Fred and George Weasley were complex characters who navigated their friendships with a mix of love, humor, and occasional insensitivity. While their jokes brought laughter to their friends and to readers alike, their treatment of people like Hermione, Neville, and Ron revealed that their pranks sometimes went too far, leaving emotional wounds that were not easily healed. Their ability to push boundaries for the sake of fun showed that, while they were loved for their humor, they were also capable of making their friends feel uncomfortable or hurt. In this way, Fred and George's pranks, while often harmless, were a reminder that friendship is not just about shared jokes, it's about mutual respect and understanding. Number 26. Fred and George Weasley used humour as a defence mechanism. Fred and George Weasley, with their signature jokes and mischief, were a constant source of levity throughout the Harry Potter series. From the moment they entered the scene, they captured the hearts of readers with their carefree antics, humour, and larger-than-life personalities. They seemed like two of the most confident and self-assured characters, forever ready with a prank or a clever remark. However, beneath their boisterous exterior lay a more complex and often heartbreaking reality. Their humour was not simply a natural expression of joy, it was, at its core, a defence mechanism. This playful mask they wore shielded them from the harsher truths of life, their fears, their grief, and their vulnerabilities. Fred and George's upbringing in the chaotic and lively Weasley household should have given them the confidence to face the world head-on, yet their humour spoke volumes about what lay beneath. Growing up in a family where love and laughter were abundant, they might have been expected to develop a healthy emotional resilience. Yet humour became their way of surviving a world that was full of uncertainty and danger. While many characters, such as Harry, openly displayed their struggles, Fred and George chose to conceal their inner turmoil behind jokes and pranks. They avoided talking about their deeper fears, never allowing their vulnerability to seep through. In many ways, their wit became a barrier, a wall that protected them from the emotional weight they otherwise carried. A telling example of this is the moment they first got involved in the Weasley Wizard Wheezes business. Fred and George were already known for their pranks and tricks at Hogwarts, but their decision to turn this hobby into a full-fledged business came with its own set of challenges. On the surface, it seemed like an exciting venture, an opportunity for them to build something entirely their own. However, as they worked to create their joke shop, it became apparent that their humour was a mask to hide a deeper anxiety. They were taking a risk in a world that had become increasingly dangerous with the return of Lord Voldemort, yet they approached it with their usual light-heartedness. They never openly discussed their fears of failure, of what would happen if the business failed or if something went wrong, instead choosing to laugh it off. One of the most significant and heartbreaking moments that reveals their use of humour as a shield is when Fred and George are in the midst of the battle at the Department of Mysteries. They are both part of the Order of the Phoenix, fighting against Death Eaters, but it is Fred's death during the Battle of Hogwarts that starkly reveals the emotional toll that humour had concealed for so long. Throughout the series, Fred and George had been the comic relief, providing moments of levity in the darkest times. Yet, even in the face of the rising darkness, they refused to let their humour fade. This was in many ways their way of dealing with the horror around them. When Fred dies during the battle, it is not just a tragic moment in the story, but a devastating blow to George. Not only has he lost his twin brother, the person who had been with him through every step of their lives, but he has also lost his emotional shield, the one person who had always been there to laugh with him, to deflect the pain with a joke. Fred's death is the ultimate test for George. It shatters the mask they had both so carefully constructed. For George, the death of Fred is not just the loss of a sibling. It is the loss of his closest companion in every sense, someone who had shared in both the laughter and the fear, someone who had stood by him always. In the aftermath of Fred's death, George is left to grapple with the weight of his grief. For much of the battle, George had been the one cracking jokes and trying to lighten the mood. But after losing Fred, that same humour became a painful reminder of what he had lost. His once bright and buoyant personality dims as he faces the reality of living in a world where his twin is no longer there. In a striking moment of vulnerability, George struggles to find meaning in life without Fred, as if his entire identity had been built around their shared sense of humor. Without Fred by his side, George is unsure how to move forward. Humor, which had once been their tool for survival, now feels empty. His struggle is evident as he finds it hard to make people laugh, the mask slipping and revealing the raw grief beneath. George's emotional journey after Fred's death speaks to the depth of their bond. The two had not only been twins, but had shared a connection that went beyond simple sibling closeness. They had been one unit, one force, and the loss of that unity left George adrift. Fred's death is not just the death of a brother, but of an entire world George had constructed around their shared jokes and pranks. For George, humor had been a survival tactic, a way to keep his emotions at bay. But after Fred's death, he is left to confront those emotions head-on. The loss of his brother forced George to face the grief that he had so carefully hidden behind his jokes. In the quiet aftermath, George begins to see the weight of their humor. It had always been a way to protect themselves from the harsh realities of their lives, but it had also kept them from truly facing their vulnerabilities. They had never discussed their deepest fears, their insecurities, or their losses. Humor had been their shield against the world, but once Fred was gone, that shield was no longer enough. George was forced to confront the overwhelming sorrow of losing a part of himself. In a particularly poignant moment, George finds a way to honor Fred's memory, not through jokes, but through a genuine moment of vulnerability, acknowledging his grief and allowing himself to mourn. As the years pass, George slowly begins to rebuild his life, but he never fully sheds the sorrow of losing Fred. He finds solace in continuing the joke shop, in maintaining the business they had started together, but the humor is no longer a mask. It is a tribute to Fred, a way to keep his memory alive. The joke shop becomes more than just a business. It is a living memorial to the brother he had lost. In this way, George's humor evolves from being a defense mechanism to a means of healing, a way to honor the past while learning to move forward. Fred and George's story is a powerful reminder that humor is often more than just a means of entertainment. It can be a coping mechanism, a way to shield ourselves from the vulnerability that comes with loss and fear. For Fred and George, their humor was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed them to face the challenges of their world with courage, but it also kept them from confronting the deeper pain that lurked beneath the surface. Fred's death, in particular, forced George to confront the fragility of their shared world, and in doing so, he was able to find a new way of living, a way that acknowledged the pain while also allowing for healing. Their story is a poignant reminder that even the most seemingly confident and cheerful people may be hiding their vulnerabilities behind a mask of humor. The Weasley twins, through their antics and pranks, gave the world a light-hearted reprieve from the darkness, but their true depth lay in their ability to hide their pain behind laughter. In the end, it was not just their jokes that defined them, but their ability to love, to grieve, and to carry on in the face of unbearable loss.